The Toronto Argonauts have just wrapped up the 2023 regular season with a 16-2 record, which ties the 1989 Edmonton Eskimos for the greatest CFL regular season record in league history. But how have these Juggernaut regular season CFL teams generally done in the Grey Cup playoffs? Let's take a look at that today. But really quickly before we get started, if you want to support the channel, be sure to like and subscribe and drop a comment down below, as we have a lot of content coming up for the Grey Cup playoffs the next couple of weeks, and I'd really appreciate it. So as I said in the intro, I'm going to be looking at the history of Juggernaut teams in the CFL regular season and how they fared in the playoffs. My criteria for this: 14 wins minimum of the regular season of the 18-game schedule, that is. I didn't include the 2021 season where the Winnipeg Blue Bombers went 11-3. I didn't quite see that as that true Juggernaut team, and it was kind of a weird season in general, so I didn't include that. But minimum 14 wins. They had to be the sole first-place team in the league that year. So any year where there were multiple 14-plus win teams and they were tied in the standings, I didn't count that. I believe 2015 is a good example of that, with Edmonton and Calgary both having 14 wins. So there wasn't really an undisputed best team in that regular season. And I only did this since 1993 just to keep some room on the board here. With that said, let's get started. So starting off in 2023, obviously this year's Toronto Argonauts finished with a 16-2 regular season record, which is really shocking considering they came into the season with a first-year starting quarterback in Chad Kelly. But what an excellent season that they've had, and obviously we'll have to wait and see how they do in the Grey Cup playoffs. We'll go back to them at the end of this video. So in 2022, we have the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, who finished with a 15-3 regular season record, ultimately winning the West Final before losing in the Grey Cup to the Toronto Argonauts. And I would say Winnipeg was the undisputed best team throughout that season, but ultimately right at the end they get upset. In 2019, we have the Hamilton Tiger Cats, who finished with a 15-3 regular season record, being one of the few East teams that is actually on this board, most of these teams being from the West Division. They ultimately ended up losing to the upstart Winnipeg Blue Bombers, who were the third seed out of the West Division in 2019, and it was a huge upset in the Grey Cup, but little did we know what Winnipeg would become in future seasons. Then moving on to 2016, we have the Calgary Stampeders, who show up a lot on this list with a 15-2-1 record. They ultimately ended up losing in the Grey Cup game to the Ottawa Red Blacks, and Calgary, that's just kind of the story of their last 30 years or so of CFL existence. They've had very good regular seasons, but have not been able to capitalize them into as many Grey Cups as they would have liked. They've won their share of Grey Cups, but certainly they could have won more with the great teams that they've had. And then in 2014, it's Calgary again with a 15-3 regular season record. Ultimately, they end up winning the Grey Cup over Hamilton that year, but that was a close call with the whole Brandon Banks punt return touchdown on the last play of the game. It easily could have went the other way, but Calgary ultimately ends up being our first Grey Cup winner on the list of these Juggernaut teams. Then in 2013, we have the Calgary Stampeders again, this time with a 14-4 record. They lose in the West Final to the Saskatchewan Roughriders, who obviously go on to win the Grey Cup at home that year. Just one of those disappointing seasons for Calgary. I didn't have the 2017 year up there, but they also lost to Toronto while having the best regular season record that season as well. So, I mean, ultimately, Calgary's had a lot of disappointment during this era of football, but they get the Grey Cup in 2014, and they lose in 2013 in the West Final. Then you have to go back to 2009, where the Montreal Alouettes went 15-3 in the regular season. Great team led by Anthony Calvillo and a bunch of great receivers. They win the Grey Cup in 2009 over Saskatchewan in a very controversial finish. Obviously, the 13th man on the field for Saskatchewan. Montreal ends up making a big comeback in that game. So the two teams on this list so far that have won the Grey Cup, they've barely skidded by in those Grey Cup games. Now, in 2007, the BC Lions went 14-3-1 and lost in the West Final to the Saskatchewan Roughriders led by Kerry Joseph. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that Lions team just was one of those teams that just choked at the end and didn't finish the job. Now, in 2004, the Montreal Alouettes show up again here. They go 14-4, but ultimately this time they lose in the East Final to the Toronto Argonauts, who go on to win the Grey Cup that season under Pinball Clemens as the head coach. Then in 2001, we have the Winnipeg Blue Bombers making another appearance on the list with a 14-4 record. This is a team led by Kahari Jones, if I'm not mistaken. Obviously, I wasn't alive back then to really watch the CFL. I was 4 years old, so they ended up losing in the Grey Cup to Calgary. Winnipeg, of course, was in the East back then, so disappointing end for them there. But then you get to the 1997 and 1996 Toronto Argonauts teams, and these are really the teams that the current Toronto Argonauts are really going to be compared to when you look at it, because these teams won back-to-back Grey Cups with Doug Flutie. They were really a true definition of a CFL juggernaut, and probably the most convincing teams to win the Grey Cup on this list. So in 1997, they go 15-3, win the Grey Cup. I forget against who, but ultimately they win the Grey Cup that year. In 1996, the year before, they go 15-3 again, and they win the Grey Cup as well. So back-to-back Grey Cup champions, 15-win seasons back-to-back. So it's going to be really hard for this current Argos teams to top that, but ultimately they went 16-2 this year, so they have one more win in the regular season standings. So maybe they'd have an argument from that perspective if they ultimately end up winning the Grey Cup this year. And then the last one I have on the list here are the 1994 Calgary Stampeders, who went 15-3 as well, and they lost in the West Division Final. So when you look at it, only 4 of the 12 teams that meet my criteria over the last 30 years have ultimately went on to win the Grey Cup, and ultimately that's not really that great of a percentage considering how dominant all these teams have been in the CFL regular season. So it'll be interesting to see how it turns out this year for Toronto. It's also worth noting, I have right here, that the 1989 Edmonton Eskimos, who the Toronto Argonauts tied for the best record in the regular season all time, they also lost in the West Final. They lost to Saskatchewan back then. So I think at the end of the day, history has not been too kind in recent memory to these juggernaut CFL regular season teams. So we'll have to see how the Argos season ends this year. So you guys will have to let me know in the comment section, do you think the Toronto Argonauts are going to win the Grey Cup this season? Be sure to let me know. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.